Hey guys, and happy Halloween! Now, we're not there quite just yet, but it is October, which is the month of Halloween, and so I figured I'd throw a few more Halloween-related tutorials into the mix. In this video, I really want to show you how to create that iconic Halloween blood-dripping text title effect. Now, this is actually a pretty simple effect to create, so this is going to be an absolute beginner tutorial. We are going to be using Adobe After Effects to create this effect, but even if you've never used Adobe After Effects before, you'll be fine following along. Actually, this might not be a bad way to get into Adobe After Effects to start enhancing your video editing skills. Once we're done creating the effect in Adobe After Effects, we're going to render it back out on a transparent background to bring it back into Premiere Pro, HitFilm or Final Cut or whatever floats your boat. But now, before I talk your ears off, let's jump right into the tutorial. Welcome to the wonderful world of Adobe After Effects, and because I want this tutorial to be easy to follow along, even if you've never used Adobe After Effects before, I am going to start out with a brand new empty project. In order to create absolutely anything in Adobe After Effects, you first need to create a composition. A composition is essentially a container for all of the visual elements that you want to put together. In order to create a composition in Adobe After Effects, on the left-hand side you will find the project panel, so make sure you're in your project panel, simply right-click into some empty space and then select Create a New Composition. This will pop up the New Composition dialog and you can give your composition a name. Let's call this one Halloween Horror Title. And you can then go through things like setting up the width and the height of the video, as well as the frame rate and the duration. Now, I'm going to leave this on 1920 by 1080, which is 1080p. Frame rate 29.97, that's just fine. And at the bottom, I'm going to set my duration to 10 seconds. Obviously, feel free to tweak this depending on what video project you are working with. And once you're happy, simply hit OK. This view now shows the contents of our current composition, and at the bottom in this timeline view here you can see we're in our Halloween Horror Title composition, and right now there's absolutely nothing in here. Let's start out by creating the actual text that we are going to melt, and for that simply come up into the toolbar of Adobe After Effects, and somewhere down the middle you will find the horizontal type tool. Simply click on this tool, then move your cursor into the preview window right into the middle of the screen. Click and then type some text. Once you're done, simply hit Escape to get out of editing the text, and then either in the top of the toolbar return to the leftmost tool, the selection tool, or just press V to return to the selection tool, and you can then click on and drag around your text to position it somewhere in your composition. Now, right now the text is a little bit too big, and in order to adjust the font as well as the size, over on the right-hand side, you should find a character tab. Now, this might be hidden behind a few other ones, but you should be able to find it on the right-hand side. If you can't find this character tab, make sure, come up into the window menu at the very top and make sure your character tab is actually enabled. Otherwise, you may not be able to see it. And then, with the text selected, you can now change the font and you can change the size as well. So maybe I'll make this a little bit smaller. And I'm actually going to change this font to something that looks a little bit more Halloween-y. Feel free to use any font that you like. Personally, I thought this Rific Free font actually suited the Halloween look quite well. Going to position this in the center of my composition and maybe make the font just a little bit bigger. So that looks pretty cool. Now let's get to melting our text. In the bottom of the Adobe After Effects interface, in your timeline view, you'll have a little timeline indicator, a little cursor that you can scrub through. This will actually play back any animations you have in your composition. Right now, all we have in our composition is this static text saying Happy Halloween. You can kind of scrub through this, but absolutely nothing will happen. So we are going to apply a melting effect to this text and then animate it so that over time the text kind of drips down like blood. In order to do that, over on the right-hand side of the interface, you should find an Effects and Presets panel. And again, it might be hidden somewhere underneath some of these other tabs. So there's an Effects and Presets panel. And again, if you can't see this, make sure you come up into your window and enable your Effects and Presets panel. And in your Effects and Presets panel, simply click into the search bar and search for the Liquify effect. Here it is, and in order to apply this effect to this text layer, simply click, drag, and then drag this effect all the way over down here to the timeline window and let go on top of your text layer. And now we've applied this effect to our text element. If you come to the bottom and scrub through your composition, again, absolutely nothing will happen because we haven't done anything with this effect yet, and we also haven't animated it. In order to start melting your text, we need to start drawing on a distortion or a liquefaction over our text. In order to do that, make sure that on the left-hand side, where you used to see the project panel, which is kind of hidden here, you're selecting the effects control panel. And again, make sure that in your window, you can actually see the effects controls for the Happy Halloween layer. So make sure you're in the effects controls where you should see the settings for the liquefy effect that we've just applied. And the liquefy effect actually works by painting on top of your text and you're kind of defining the distortions. In order to do that, the liquefy effect contains a number of tools. Now the tool that I want to use is on the top left hand side here. It's the warp tool. So let's simply click on that to make sure it's selected. At the bottom here you will find a tab for the warp tool options. So let's expand that. And right now if I go over my preview window, the little circle defines my brush. So that's my brush size. If I now paint, you can see I'm distorting this layer by painting over it. Let's go Ctrl Z to undo that because it's not actually what I want to do. Instead, I actually want to make this brush size a little bit smaller. Maybe I'll go to about 20 or so. I want this to be fairly small because I want to kind of drip these characters down individually. And I'm going to increase this brush pressure from 50 to 100. So I'm going to increase the brush pressure to full power. And now what I can do, I can actually come into my text and kind of click and drag down to distort this text and kind of give it this really drippy, this Halloween blood drip feeling. And I can paint this on in any way I want. I can make some of them a bit shorter, some of them a little bit longer. I'm just really painting on distortions to give this blood dripping effect. Feel free to paint over the same area multiple times, and if anything starts looking funny, you can always press Ctrl Z to undo that last stroke, so that doesn't look too bad. And I'm also going to distort the top, kind of like it's melting in from the top as well. But again, just feel free to distort this text in any way that you want. So that's essentially going to be your final look, the final melted look of the text that we're now creating. So kind of just going over this and just painting it all on. Cool, that looks pretty nice. Let's talk about animating this effect. Again, if you come to the bottom of the interface and scrub through your composition, you can also press space to actually play this composition back. So you can press space, play this back, and press space again to stop. However, again, we haven't animated anything yet. Now, in order to animate this liquefaction effect or this melting effect of the text, simply come back up into the effects controls. In the liquefy effect, you will find a property called distortion percentage. By default, that will be set to 100%. And if you click and drag to 0%, you can see all of the distortion is gone. As we increase this to 100%, you can see the text is kind of dripping down. And that's exactly the animation effect that we want to create. Now, in order to create animation in Adobe After Effects, we need to create keyframes. In order to do that, let's make sure we're at the very beginning of the composition because that's where I want my animation to start. In the liquefy effect, reduce the distortion percentage down to 0%. And then on the left-hand side of the property, you'll find this little stopwatch icon. That is an option to enable or disable keyframes for this property. If you click onto the stopwatch icon, let's click it now, it's going to turn blue and we've now enabled keyframes for the distortion percentage property on our liquefy effect. If you come into your timeline and expand this little twirly next to your text layer, and then you expand the twirly next to the effects and the twirly next to the liquefy effect, you should see down here the distortion percentage has this stopwatch icon next to it, which is blue. It's also got this little blue diamond icon here. And on our timeline at position 0, you will see this little diamond. And this represents a keyframe that we've placed within our composition for this property. Now, we have keyframed this property to be at 0% at this time, at 0 seconds. Let's move this playhead forward to maybe about 2 seconds in. So 2:00F means 2 seconds into your animation. And let's increase this distortion percentage. And you can either increase it down here in the timeline or up in the liquefy effect. Simply click on this property and you can either drag it or you can also just click on it and type a number. So maybe I'll go with 100% and just see what that looks like. And that looks pretty cool. I might actually push this just a little bit further. Now I want to avoid pushing it too far, otherwise I'm getting these weird looking twisted distortions and loops, which I don't really want. So maybe let's not push it too far, about 100%. And again, on our current timeline cursor position, it has created another diamond, another keyframe, because we've changed this property with keyframes enabled. And now if you scrub through our composition, you can see our text melting like it's dripping blood. Let's take the timeline indicator and drag it back to the beginning of our composition and simply press space to play back the actual animation. And that looks pretty cool. Now, one thing that happens with these keyframes, the interpolation from 0% to 100% on our distortion percentage for the liquefy effect happens linearly, which means the speed of change is always constant. It's always the same, and it does look a little bit unnatural. One thing I highly recommend you do, make sure you're in the selection tool. So make sure you're here selected the selection tool, or you can always press V to return to it. Select both of your keyframes and you can just draw a box around them on your timeline. So make sure they're both selected, so they're both blue, and then press F9 on your keyboard. The shape of the keyframes will change and it will indicate that you're now easing in and out of the animation. So it starts slow, gets a bit faster, and then slows down towards the end. And it'll just make the animation look a whole lot more organic. So let's rewind and play this back one more time, again, just by pressing the space bar. Maybe we'll do that one more time. That didn't really play back in real time because it had to render out the effect. And you might find that in After Effects that depending on the power of your computer and the complexity of your effect, things may not play back in real time. So let's play this back one more time. Cool, I like this effect. That actually looks a whole lot better. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to add an animation of the text starting out nice and white and friendly and then turning blood red as it drips down into this really distorted horror Halloween-y text. In the timeline window, just use the scroll bar to come back to the top. And let's close this twirly here on our text layer because we don't need to see this effect anymore. We're going to apply another effect, a gradient effect that slowly fades in and then kind of makes our text look all bloody. In order to do that, let's once again come up into the Effects and Presets panel and let's search for the Gradient Ramp effect. You should find that down here under Generate Gradient Ramp, and let's drag this effect onto our Happy Halloween text layer. And you may notice that it just got a little bit darker. And if I zoom out a little bit, by the way, you can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out of your composition, or down here on the left, you can also change the percentage of the size. You can go down to maybe show it at 25%. With this gradient ramp effect selected, and I've just unselected it accidentally, I can't actually tweak this right now. So make sure that you select this gradient ramp effect and you'll see these 2 points at the top and at the bottom. And these are your start point for the gradient and your end point for the gradient. And you can see the properties change here as I move these points around. You can always tweak them here in the effect settings on the left-hand side, but it's just tedious to move them around here. You can also just click onto them in the preview and just drag them around. So what I want to do is I'm going to kind of drag the start of ramp, this top one, down here on top of my text and make sure the other one is kind of at the bottom. And I'm going to change the color. Let me zoom back in by scrolling up on my mouse wheel. That looks much better. And I'm going to leave the start color at the top at black, but I'm going to change my end color from white over to red. And you can see we've got this really nice bloody Happy Halloween text here. Now, the last thing I want to do, I want to animate this effect so that right now our text already starts out looking bloody, which, well, you may want, but I'd like it to start out white and only start getting bloody once the blood starts to drip. In order to do that, let's come back to the beginning of the composition. In the gradient ramp settings, you have this blend with original property, and if you ramp this up from 0 to 100, you'll see it takes on the original color before the gradient was applied. However, at 0%, it does not blend with the original at all, and it is just the gradient color. So what I want to do is I want to ramp this up to 100, so our text is nice and white. Click onto this little stopwatch icon next to the blend with original property to enable keyframes. Then I'm going to move my cursor forward to 2 seconds, which, remember, is when our text is fully dripped down and turned into our horror Halloween style. And now I'm going to change this blend with original property and lower it down to 0. Now this will have created 2 keyframes, and you can verify that either by twirling all of this open. You can also actually, with the layer selected, simply press U on your keyboard to reveal all of the properties that have keyframes on them. So let's press U. And there you can see it's the distortion percentage, which we animated before, but now we also have keyframes on this gradient ramp blend with original property from 100 to 0%. And if you scrub through now, it will start out nice and white, and then it turns into a really Halloweeny blood color. Again, just to make the animation look a little bit more natural, let's simply select both of these keyframes and press F9 on your keyboard to enable ease in and ease out animation. And let's rewind our composition. Click somewhere just so we unselect all of these layers and we don't see all of these effect settings and markers anymore. And press space to play the effect back. Cool, that looks really nice. Now, I do find that the effect plays back just a little bit too quick actually, and you can either create new keyframes, but you can also move these keyframes around in your timeline view. So I can easily click on this keyframe here for the distortion percentage, maybe push it forward to about 4 seconds, and maybe I want the gradient to finish off a little bit later as well. Now this kind of adds a little bit, it just makes it look a little bit more dramatic. Maybe I'll make this almost 5 seconds long and the gradient takes about 4 seconds to kick in. Let's rewind and play this back. Cool, I'm really liking how that looks. Now the last thing we need to do is we need to export this title animation so that you can bring it into Premiere Pro, HitFilm, Final Cut or any other video editing program and place it on top of your video. Now, looking at this composition and this animation, you may think that, well, it's got a solid black background, but that is actually just the default color in Adobe After Effects for your composition. In our composition, all we have is this text layer. There isn't actually a background in here. And you can verify that if you come up into your preview window and down here at the bottom, you'll find this little checkerboard icon that's called Toggle Transparency Grid. And if you click that, you'll see this is actually text on a transparent background. The reason you see black is just so it's a bit easier to see, and if you don't export your video with transparency enabled, you will get a black background. But let me show you how to export this with a transparent background so that you can place it on top of any other video. The easiest way to do that is make sure that, let's return to the project panel. You can use these little arrows here. I think in older versions of After Effects you can just click next to it, you'll see the other panel. I'll just switch back to the project panel. Make sure that your composition is selected, and you can double click to make sure that you're actually in that composition. Then come up into the menu bar, go to Composition and select Add to Render Queue. This will open up the render queue, and this is where you define and export your videos directly from Adobe After Effects. There are 3 things you need to set up. First, you need to set up your render settings, and you'll find, I don't know what this will say for you, I think it might just say custom or whatever your default settings are. So you can simply click on this name and this will define your render settings. Don't worry too much about it, this is just all about the quality. You really just want to make sure that your quality is set to best and your resolution to full, otherwise you may end up with a video that's only half the size or seems really pixelated. So just make sure this is really set to full quality for the final render. Hit OK. Next is the output module, and this is where the trick happens. So click on the settings for the output module, and in here you need to make sure that you export your video in a format that supports an alpha or a transparency channel. If you use a codec that does not have a transparency channel, as I mentioned, you will end up with that black background. So one of the formats that I personally like to use, I like to use QuickTime, but feel free to use some of the other ones. Just make sure you can export that alpha channel and then come into the format options down here on the bottom. So let's click onto format options. Oh, that one's a little bit big. Let me shrink this down a little bit. And in here, you need to select your video codec. The codec is essentially the language that gets used to compress your video and turn it into a file that can then be played back on your computer. And in here, depending on what codec you select, for example, let's select H.264 and hit OK. You may notice that in your video output settings under the channels, you can only select RGB, which is just red, green and blue, or the alpha. You can't actually export RGB and the alpha channel together. So I can't use this codec for exporting my text. Let's come back into the format options and change this video codec from H.264 over to PNG, which I know supports alpha channels. And you may also want to make sure that your basic video settings, the quality is actually set to 100%. Small quality means, well, low quality, but it also gives you a smaller file size. High quality means, well, you get a high quality, a crisp image, but the file size will be a little bit bigger. But because our text is really short and it doesn't contain much visual information, I'm going to jack this up all the way to 100, hit OK. And now in my video output, make sure that you change your channels from RGB over to RGB plus alpha. You really want that transparency channel. Otherwise, as I said, you're going to get a black background. Now you can do things like resize the output, crop it down, and you can enable audio. I would recommend just turn your audio to off because, well, unless you've added music into your composition, you don't even need to worry with that. Hit OK. And now the last thing we need to define is an output location. So simply click onto the output to options. And this will allow you to select a location on your hard drive to save your file to and give it a name. Let's call this one Halloween Horror Title. Hit save. And now the last thing you need to do is simply hit render to render out your title animation. Now I am speeding this up so you don't have to sit through this. Probably takes about 30 seconds to a minute, depending on your computer speed. And once this is done, you should end up with a file on your hard drive that contains your final animated Halloween horror text title. And when you're playing this back, you will notice that, I still got a black background and it doesn't even animate, but that might simply be due to whichever video player you're using. Like right now I'm using VLC, which doesn't actually play this file back properly. So let me jump into Adobe Premiere Pro and import this title and show you that it actually looks exactly the way we want it to. Here we are in Adobe Premiere Pro, and this should work exactly the same way no matter which editing software you use. Let's bring up our title. There it is, Halloween Horror Text Title. Let's drop it in. And as you can see, this text title actually has a transparent background, so you can just drop it on top of your video, and it actually contains our blood dripping Halloween animation. So I hope this showed you how easy it is to create really cool looking titles in Adobe After Effects and incorporate them into your own film projects. And that's all there is to it. If you enjoyed this video and you would like to help me out, please hit that like button, share the video around, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new. I always appreciate all of your feedback, so if you have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. And finally, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.